Thank you very much. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to the Shell Distinguished Lecture Series in the James A. Baker Institute for Public Policy. Shell is pleased to support this lecture series because we recognize the critical role that sound public policy plays in all of our lives, as governments, as businesses, organizations, communities, and certainly as individuals. We're also pleased to participate in Baker Institute programs because they reflect Secretary Baker's commitment to integrity, statesmanship, and bold leadership, all of which we know are necessities to meet the challenges of the 21st century. This afternoon's speaker is Ambassador Wendy Sherman, currently a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and a fellow at the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics. Ambassador Sherman was sworn in as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in September 2011 and served until October of 2015. In this role, she led the U.S. delegation for the historic Iran nuclear talks and traveled to more than 50 countries, including Libya, Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan, in between marathon negotiating sessions with the Iranians. Prior to this position, she served as vice chair of Albright Stonebridge Group, a global strategy firm, and also a member of the investment committee of Albright Capital Management, an affiliated investment advisory firm focused on emerging markets. Ambassador Sherman served as counselor for the State Department from 1997 to 2001, as well as special advisor to President Clinton and policy coordinator on North Korea. From 1993 to 1996, under Secretary of State Warren Christopher, she was Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs. Following her announced departure from the State Department, Secretary of State John Kerry said of the ambassador, "Sherman's mentoring of colleagues, her experience, her passion for diplomacy, her calm in the storm set her apart as a great Undersecretary of State." A White House statement also indicated that President Obama had long counted on Wendy's unique combination of intellect, toughness, and persistence, which have made her one of the most effective diplomats of her generation. It is an honor to have her with us today, so please join me in extending a warm welcome to Ambassador Wendy Sherman.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here with you all, and thank you, Scott, for those warm words of introduction. It's really quite an honor to be here as part of the Shell Distinguished Lecture Series at the Baker Center. When former Treasury Secretary Jim Baker, he's really former everything, so I could go on for about a half an hour, began the center, he said he wanted to bring together, quote, statesmen, scholars, and students to create a bridge between the world of ideas and the world of action, unquote. Under the leadership, from the inception of the center, of Ambassador Ed Dirigian, who served 8 presidents and who is a premier diplomat and thinker, the center has become one of the top 4 think tanks in the country, lodged in the university. And the Shell series is, quote, a commitment to defining the role of statesmanship, integrity, and bold leadership, as Scott said, in meeting the challenges of the 21st century. I think you've already seen and heard today the realization of this vision in the extraordinary scholars and practitioners who have already spoken at this colloquium on U.S. Iran relations at a crossroads. In my remarks, I hope to bring some additional experience and insight into what has occurred and where we are as this discussion continues today. In September 2015, nearly 20 foreign ministers sat around the same table in Vienna, Austria, to talk about the future of Syria. Representatives from Saudi Arabia and Iran, Russia and China, Iraq and Turkey, and a dozen others. In one chair, representing the United States, sat Secretary of State John Kerry. It's always a significant statement by the international community when enemies and allies share the same table. But the colorful flags, ornate surroundings, and diplomatic nameplates couldn't conceal years of tragic failure by the international community. In fact, its consequences were the very reason this historic meeting was necessary. 12 million Syrians forced to flee their homes. Countless families wiped out by barrel bombs and chemical weapons. Children choked to death in the backs of trucks. Others washed up lifeless on shores as they made a dangerous journey with their parents who were just trying to give their kids a future of freedom. Nor could the international community escape the reality of the vacuum Syria's internal conflict created, one filled by brutal terrorists brazenly beheading Syrians and Westerners, bedeviling the Middle East and the world. Ending this tragic spiral was the task of this team of rivals in Vienna, Saudi Arabia and Iran, whose enmity for each other is legend, Turkey, a neighbor to and sometimes challenger of Iran that is housing untold number of refugees, and European nations desperate to stem the flow of refugees that threatens their economic and political stability. Russia and Iran, which support and supply Syria's President Assad, and the United States, which supports and supplies his opposition. In fact, on the same day the ministers met, the United States announced it was sending special forces into Syria to help the opposition. There was no shortage of disagreements around the table, but on this challenge, these countries have come together in common cause to find a peaceful solution to the brutal fighting in Syria and defeat the Islamic State, or ISIL or Daesh, to find success where the international community has so tragically failed and continues to fail to this day. As I watched the reports of the talks, I thought that this scene was familiar to me. The parades of delegations gathering in Vienna, the flags of allies and enemies flying beside one another, the anxiety of whether this meeting would bring historic change or further deepen mistrust. It looked familiar to me because just 3 months before then, I'd sat in the same city and witnessed history. In July, as you know, the United States and our partners agreed on an understanding with Iran to ensure it never obtains a nuclear weapon. And then again in January of this year, the same players actually reached implementation day, and the agreement became real. There was no shortage of disagreements around that July table, too. Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia, China, Iran, and the United States and the European Union went back and forth over years of contentious negotiations. Each country faced opposition back home and from international quarters. In spite of the resistance and rivalries inside and outside the room, the powers agreed on a way forward that would soon be backed unanimously by the United Nations Security Council. This effort is, of course, far from over. Implementing the understanding is a challenge unto itself over a very long period of time, though the initial and critical steps have been taken. But the negotiation was a success in the various nations' ability to come to an agreement despite ongoing deep mistrust, much of which, especially between America and Iran, persists. How did that happen? What made the Iran negotiation possible? What were the conditions that encouraged conciliation and compromise? How can those answers to those questions shed light on similar negotiations that have succeeded and failed? For example, why have the United States and Cuba been able to finally start down a road of normalization after a half-century of an embargo, even an embargo that is still in place today? Why is a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine still so elusive, in spite of the fact that the substance of a solution has been clear for years. And of course, why were we able to find an answer to Iran's nuclear ambitions, but have failed to do so with North Korea? I want to talk today, using the Iran example, about what it takes for a negotiation to succeed, how the Iran agreement came together successfully, how it compares to what has and hasn't happened elsewhere in the world, and what lessons we can take, starting in Syria, circling the globe, and spanning the decades to come. The story of what makes a negotiation successful, of course, starts far from the negotiating table. This particular story starts with the establishment of an Iranian nuclear program way back in 1974, when John Kerry, the Secretary of State who helped to negotiate the agreement, was still a law student at Boston College. The man who established that nuclear program was an ally of the United States, the Shah, and he set a goal of building 23 nuclear power plants in 20 years. But the Shah's regime wouldn't last that long. 5 years later, in 1979, a few important things happened. First, that year's Iranian revolution at first halted the nuclear program. Second, the leaders of that revolution held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days, cementing for decades an unforgiving mistrust that actually began with the getting rid of Mossadegh in 1953, a mistrust between our countries that still remains. And third, A.Q. Khan, who was the father of Pakistan's nuclear program, gave Iran a schematic of a centrifuge, essentially the first page of an instruction manual for how to enrich the kind of uranium you'd need to build a bomb. Fast forward a couple of decades. By 2002, it became clear to the world that Iran had a full-fledged uranium enrichment program at a facility called Natanz, and it was working toward building a plutonium facility at Iraq. Now, with the right kind of uranium, or the right kind of plutonium, the same kind Iran was developing at these facilities, you can fuel a nuclear weapon. So soon after, Great Britain, France, and Germany started negotiating with Iran, which had at that time only 164 centrifuges with which to enrich uranium. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which monitors nuclear activity, had also expressed its concern about Iran's intentions and urged it to both stop enriching and to come clean about its program. And in 2007, the United States published an intelligence report, a public one, finding that at least until 2003, Iran had a nuclear weapons program intent on developing both a bomb and the means to launch that bomb. By 2009, the evidence had become even more damning. The United States, Great Britain, and France publicly shared intelligence with the world that Iran had developed a covert underground facility known as Fordo, where it was producing highly enriched uranium. Between enriched uranium, plutonium, and its covert facilities, by now it was clear that Iran was working every pathway it could to cook the ingredients one would need for a nuclear weapon. What followed was a long process of trial and error among the international community to try and make sure Iran's nuclear energy program would be a peaceful one, not a weapons-producing one. The United Nations Security Council imposed sanctions on Iran. A coalition led by the United States imposed sanctions too. America's own unilateral sanctions had stopped other countries from importing Iranian oil and froze Iranian assets in banks abroad. All told, the world had imposed on Iran the most extensive and effective sanctions regime ever for a situation like this. Iran's economy declined sharply. But those sanctions never stopped Iran's nuclear program. They did, however, bring Iran to the negotiating table in 2011. By that time, the 164 centrifuges in Iran had grown over the years to 19,000. The threat was now of a completely different magnitude. The negotiations fell to the political directors of the various governments, and at that time, I was the political director of the United States government. So my counterparts and I spent 2 years meeting in Moscow and Istanbul, in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and even in the middle of a sandstorm in war-torn Baghdad, where we discussed this critical question of global security, while our own personal security was somewhat questionable. These early negotiations were frustrating and pretty much fruitless. The High Representative of the European Union, Catherine Ashton, led our side of the negotiations in English. Saeed Jalili led the Iranian side in Farsi. But the language wasn't the only barrier. Each side's proposals were ambitious, but often had little in common, meaning the gulfs between us never got smaller. Meanwhile, Iran kept blocking the IAEA's efforts to fully monitor its program. And as Iran kept spinning its centrifuges, the world kept spinning too. Iraq was hoping reconciliation between the United States and Iran would help stabilize its own future. Israel's prime minister warned that the world was reaching a point of no return, memorably drawing a literal red line across a cartoon bomb at the United Nations General Assembly. In Tehran, the brief flicker of the Green Movement that promised to bring reform to the Islamic Republic was snuffed out before its light had a chance to shine. But when the next election rolled around, the outcome offered a glimmer of hope. Iranians elected Hassan Rouhani, a conservative cleric approved by the supreme leader, but at least one who understood that Iran's future depended on economic reform. He understood that for Iran to prosper, sanctions would have to be lifted, and Iran's international isolation would have to end. It finally appeared as if President Obama might have an Iranian leader with whom he could negotiate. Combined with a secret back channel that had been tested with the help of Oman, the only Gulf country with a strong relationship with Iran, a real opportunity might just be possible. President Obama took advantage of this opportunity by making a very critical policy decision. He understood that Iran knew what it knew. In the decades since A.Q. Khan first passed along the schematic for a centrifuge, Iran had mastered the entire nuclear fuel cycle. While we had a real military option at the ready, no military action can bomb away knowledge. It might set Iran's program back a couple of years, maybe a little bit more, but when Iran inevitably rebuilt it after a military strike, it would likely do so covertly and underground. That wouldn't solve the problem, and indeed it would create new problems. So President Obama agreed that his negotiators could present the possibility that Iran might be able to maintain a very limited civil nuclear program. And the world would use intrusive monitoring and verification to make sure that program would be an exclusively peaceful one. The President's realistic understanding of Iran's capabilities unlocked a door that would perhaps lead down the hallway to success. The first negotiations were held in secret, a result of that back channel relationship I mentioned that Oman had helped broker. When you think about it, secret negotiations seem almost impossible in an age of GPS satellites, drone cameras, 24/7 media coverage, and endless government leaks. But it worked. It was too important not to. Our negotiators left their homes without telling their families where they were going or why. They flew in unmarked planes to Muscat and showed up in unmarked cars to a small guest house on the Gulf of Oman. When State Department staff asked the operations center which can track down any diplomat, anytime, anywhere in the world, ask our families. About their boss's whereabouts, they heard excuses about illnesses, the needs of older parents, and family commitments. In Oman, and then on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York, the negotiators drew up a 4-page document, leaving some important blanks to be filled in. The bottom line was that Iran would freeze and even roll back its nuclear program in return for some small sanctions relief to buy the time necessary to negotiate a more comprehensive plan. That first document was known as the Joint Plan of Action. After I joined those secret talks, remarkably and ably led by one of our great diplomats, Bill Burns, it fell to me to bring the Joint Plan of Action to the larger group that included the other permanent members of the UN Security Council, the European Union, and Germany. I wouldn't say any of our partners were shocked that negotiations had been quietly underway, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt their pride and sense of value. Our European colleagues were irritated. Some were upset because they had long been willing to allow a limited program, the key that unlocked the stalemate. And it was the United States who, until now, had always called that a non-starter. And let's be honest, no country likes to be presented with a document that is nearly a fait accompli and be asked to sign on. Some difficult conversations ensued on our side, but we had bigger things to worry about, like those important blanks in the Joint Plan of Action we still had to fill in. We met in Geneva in November of 2013. Instead of unmarked planes and secret meetings, these talks happened under the glare of literally hundreds of cameras. We were so optimistic that the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, had a bottle of champagne waiting on ice, sort of strange when you're dealing with Iran. But last-minute concerns, most publicly by France, but held by all of us, sent everyone home sober and sobered. 2 weeks later, we were back in Geneva for non-stop negotiating sessions. All of us, including Secretary Kerry, stayed up all night. Some of the behind-the-scenes players who had relationships essential to the success of the agreement, diplomats like Deputy Secretary of State Bill Burns and Jake Sullivan, a policy advisor to former Secretary Clinton, were ushered in and out of maintenance elevators and hidden away in the secretary's suite like characters in a Molière play. At 4 a.m. on the Sunday before Thanksgiving, all of the countries involved agreed to the Joint Plan of Action. As that chapter closed, another began. Now that we had frozen and rolled back parts of Iran's nuclear program, we now had the space we needed to negotiate the comprehensive agreement. Everyone, including Iran, knew what the objective was: ensuring that Iran cannot obtain a nuclear weapon ever, and ensuring that Iran's very limited civil nuclear program would be subject to intrusive and extensive monitoring. And because the other end of the bargain would lift sanctions on Iran and end its isolation from the international community, everyone, including Iran, was invested in getting the agreement done. Again, the world kept spinning, even if by now Iran's centrifuges, in essence, had stopped doing so. Russia intervened in Ukraine and illegally annexed Crimea. Iran continued its destabilizing actions in the Middle East and detained innocent American citizens. China challenged free navigation in the South China Sea. Events in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen presented their own challenges. The Gulf Arab states grew frustrated that a deal wouldn't address their other regional concerns, even though originally they said it shouldn't because they weren't in the room. Israel's challenges to any deal with Iran grew louder and louder. And here in America, the rhetoric of domestic politics grew as heated as ever. With so many players involved, it was like playing several games of multidimensional chess at the same time. The negotiations were bilateral, trilateral, and ultimately multilateral. We found ourselves negotiating with each of our P5+1 and EU partners one-on-one and in groups. And we were simultaneously negotiating with Israel, and with the Gulf states, and with other partners and allies throughout the world who had a stake in the outcome, and even within the United States government, and certainly with the United States Congress. And, oh yeah, every once in a while, we'd occasionally negotiate with Iran. Everything was moving simultaneously, and every piece was complex in its own right. I make this point because one of the keys to a successful negotiation is keeping everyone on side as you proceed. Even if parties disagree in the end, and there were those, even in the U.S., who did so, you might have noticed, you want to make sure that the understanding you've reached is as durable as possible. After all, it's not unheard of for parties even to break treaties once those treaties no longer serve their interests. That's one reason the Joint Plan of Action was so important. During the nearly 2 years it was in place, Iran and everyone else fully complied with it. That served as a confidence-building measure. If coordinating so many players was like playing multidimensional chess, coming to a consensus on so many issues at once was like solving a Rubiks Cube. All of the elements had to be on the table at once, and they all had to fit together perfectly before the last piece would click into place. The conceptual work and the highly technical work had to be done at the same time. From February 2013 to May of 2014, we met for days at a time in Vienna. Because there were so many variables, the political directors and our teams of experts took turns holding what amounted to multilateral seminars on every subject that would have to be agreed to if we were going to reach a comprehensive understanding. One country would lead a seminar on uranium enrichment. Another would lead a seminar on the Iraq reactor. Another would lead one on transparency and verification measures, another on sanctions, another on military dimensions, another on the UN Security Council resolutions, and so on. So maybe it's no surprise why when we hit our first deadline in July 2014, we needed an extension. That's what was happening at my level. At the foreign minister level, Secretary Kerry and Iranian Minister Javad Zarif were developing and deepening a relationship. Zarif was educated in the United States. He lived here for 30 years. In fact, he got his doctorate in international law and policy from the University of Denver at the school now named for Madeleine Albright's father and in the city where John Kerry was born. Zarif lived in the United States, as I said, for nearly 30 years and speaks fluent English, as do all of the Iranian negotiators in these rounds. So by now, all of our negotiations were conducted and written in English. Kerry knew these negotiations wouldn't erase a profound level of mistrust, but he knew there were still common interests and solutions that could satisfy those interests. Importantly, Kerry and Zarif saw the same opportunity, a potentially, positively historic moment. Throughout the negotiations, Secretary Kerry was clear-eyed, decisive, and keenly analytical about what needed to be done to close all of Iran's pathways to fissile material to a nuclear weapon. He engaged with intensity, patience, detail, and a belief in the power of personal relationships in diplomacy. And he had the full support of the President of the United States. Experts on both sides also built relationships that were critical to success based on their technical expertise. For example, our Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, and Ali Salehi, a Vice President of Iran and the chair of its Atomic Energy Organization, are both MIT alums. When Minister Zarif met resistance in Tehran to some of the technical solutions, he wisely brought in Salehi, and we brought in Moniz. Now, that doesn't mean everything came up roses. Quite the contrary. On several occasions, we all, including the Secretary, thought we might have hit an immovable obstacle. On one occasion, I was in Geneva for a bilateral meeting with Iran, and Secretary Kerry was on his way to join us from London. But Iran had been particularly intransigent this time. I spoke with Secretary Kerry, and he asked me to deliver a message to the Iranians that unless we made some progress, Kerry would stay behind in London. That broke the impasse. But when Kerry got to Geneva, a difficult meeting awaited him anyway. It was so difficult that the secretary unexpectedly and uncharacteristically slammed his hand so hard on the table that a pen flew across the room and hit my counterpart, Abbas Araghchi. As the world kept spinning, another source of constant tension were two political systems revving up for heated campaigns. It won't surprise you to hear that one of those political systems is ours. 41 Republican senators sent a letter to Tehran opposing the agreement, and congressional Republicans invited the Prime Minister of Israel to make his case against the deal from the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. But it might surprise some of you to hear that the other political system is Iran's. Because Iran has a supreme leader, we tend to forget how intense its own domestic politics are. You all have heard a great deal about that today, and I'm glad you have, because in fact, Iran's political divisions are very real. President Rouhani had to worry about his opposition in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as Iran's parliamentary elections approached, and the supreme leader did too. Even the hardliners in Iran have to worry about hardliners. None of these events changed President Obama's objectives or his requirements for a deal. But they did make it clear that the deal must be high quality, able to meet critics, and win, particularly since Congress would be able to have its say before it was all over. It also made clear that if a deal couldn't be reached soon, it was both more likely that negotiations wouldn't be possible again for a very, very long time, and we might have to consider military action. The framework for the comprehensive deal came together in early April 2015 in Lausanne, France. The details of that understanding, I believe, surprised the world and surpassed expectations in its detail. We all left Lausanne hopeful and optimistic. Hope and optimism that would be dashed on more than one occasion as the roller coaster continued through last summer. The devil was in the detailed language, and enough technical specifics remained unresolved to jeopardize the entire deal. The final 27 days of this marathon were very, very long ones. We were back in Vienna, where my balanced diet included turkey schnitzel, chicken schnitzel, and Wiener Schnitzel. I ate exactly one meal outside the hotel during those 4 weeks. I was grateful that our hotel hosts managed to put together a July 4th celebration for us, in part out of patriotism, but in truth, because it really was nice to mix up the menu with hamburgers and corn on the cob. Secretary Kerry had joined us on June 26 and stayed 2.5 weeks, which is the longest period of time a Secretary of State has ever stayed in one place abroad. When we announced success on July 14th, there was virtually no time for celebrating. We were all on the phone with members of Congress from that day until September 17th. Making sure the comprehensive agreement we reached would stand. In the end, it did. And I am hopeful that the agreement will be successfully implemented and the world safer. So that's the very short version of how the Iran negotiations came together. So what can we learn? What made this negotiation work? How does it help us to better understand successes, failures, and future efforts? Let me very briefly tell you 10 quick lessons. First, there was and remains a clear objective. The President of the United States articulated unequivocally that Iran can never obtain a nuclear weapon, and that its program must be proven to be exclusively peaceful. We have partners and allies who oppose this agreement, including some who want to address other issues. But even they do not disagree that this was our chief objective. That clarity and commitment from the top is essential, especially during tough moments. From the President and from Secretary Kerry, I always knew, and my extraordinary team always knew, what we could and couldn't do, where the trades were, where the flexibility existed, and where it did not. Second, while domestic and international politics put constant pressure on these talks, all parties managed to stay focused on what was happening inside the negotiating room. That wasn't easy, especially in today's media environment, and especially as some rogue negotiators were tweeting from under the table, trying to influence the talks. Third, while every party experienced setbacks from time to time, everyone demonstrated the political will to get the deal done. Fourth, we understood each other's vested interests, both where they converged and where they diverged, and we tried to match everyone's priorities with the larger shared goal, and to do so in good faith. Fifth, timing really is everything. There is a reality to ripeness, and we had it. The parties understood the alternatives to a deal, and while those alternatives were real, none of them were attractive. Sixth, all of the parties had leverage, particularly Iran and particularly the United States. Seventh, all of the parties had stamina. All of the parties built the necessary technical expertise, teams, and internal decision-making processes to develop creative solutions, incentives, and options. Eighth, everyone had excellent intelligence, excellent channels of communications, and sufficient time to consult, even if it was at 3 in the morning. Ninth, for the United States at least, the negotiations were never about trust. My counterpart, Abbas Araghchi, and I both became grandparents for the first time during the negotiations. Even amid the human moments, when Abbas and I would share videos of our grandchildren, the next negotiating session could be just as mistrustful as the one before. And 10th, everyone compromised some, but no one conceded everything, with one major exception. Iran could never have a nuclear weapon. Those are the ingredients: the right leaders and the right leadership, the right and shared objectives, the right team, and the right time. In that lens, the transformation on U.S.-Cuba relations looks familiar. Many of the same factors have now been realized, including the politics of the region that now support the path to normalization. Like with Iran, Cuba required a secret channel to protect what would be seen by some as a very controversial decision. And of course, this was largely a bilateral effort that rested in the hands of the leaders of two countries. The stories with less happy endings. In Korea, it's first important to remember that the North and South are still not at peace. Their relationship teeters on an armistice that's now 62 years old. More a cult than a country in many ways, North Koreans and their leaders are easily some of the most isolated people in the world. The current leader, like his father and grandfather, rarely travels outside the country, and he rules with a tyranny that has left his people malnourished and poor. There have been moments of possibility, one in the Carter administration, one in the Clinton administration, but time got in the way. And though the six-party talk shared an objective, they didn't share the same sense of urgency, means, or tactics. And China, the country with the greatest economic leverage, remains reluctant to use that leverage in fear of a collapse of North Korea and the unanswered questions of American presence, the form of a reunified Korea, the presence of nuclear weapons, the economic costs, I could go on, missile defense, its geopolitical position, and more. Until China's questions can be answered, I believe a solution will remain elusive and instability will persist. Many books can be written about each of these cases, have and will be, but none has or will inspire more volumes than the failures to achieve Middle East peace, which Ed knows so well. The terms of a deal have been known for so long that the same arguments and suggestions, even the same words, repeat themselves administration after administration. But unfortunately, the leaders who ultimately have to agree with one another cannot find their way to an agreement. And no outside country, even the United States, can cajole them into doing so. Tempered by the tragic assassinations of the men who tried peace, Sadat, Rabin, and others, the politics of status quo remain undefeated. And indeed, as in many places where there is violence, peace may not come until the parties truly believe the alternative to peace is worse. Which brings us back to Syria. There is no doubt that where there is conflict, where there is war, where there is violence on the ground, the stakes are different, the interests are different, and the immediate catastrophe is profound. One would imagine, one would certainly hope that such realities might sooner rather than later inspire a peaceful outcome. But war doesn't rage at times of common sense and common cause. War rages at times of tragedy. War doesn't bring opposite sides together. War pushes everyone further apart. So Syria remains a proxy war within a war. It remains the scene of a hideous human condition that should compel every party to seek change. But in reality, Syria remains the hardest Rubiks Cube to solve. We have seen a tentative ceasefire continue, much to everyone's surprise, certainly to mine. And quiet negotiations continue, although Russia, and particularly Iran, persist in strengthening Assad, making a diplomatic resolution more difficult. And returning to the main story of these remarks, Iran, we are now seeing the political balancing act of the supreme leader in his support for missile launches and buttressing the IRGC and Hezbollah, actions that must be met with sanctions, security support for the Gulf and for Israel, and a firm hand in Syria negotiations. In the end, however, it is those who can see the promise of peace through the fog of war who can change history. And that is, for me, the most compelling story of the Iran negotiation, a story that I hope will soon be repeated in our many other confounding challenges. On July 14th, the day the foreign ministers sat around the same table in Vienna while the ink on the Iranian agreement was drying, they took a moment to reflect on what they had accomplished together. There was no press present. No one tweeted under the table. Theirs was a moment in history, but it was also a moment just for the ministers and the political directors. Every minister spoke, and every minister was moving. Everyone was eloquent in reviewing what had happened, including Javad Zarif. John Kerry was the last to speak. At the end of his remarks, spoken from the heart, not from the paper, his voice got softer. He choked up, and his voice started to tremble. He shared what a searing experience it was to have gone to Vietnam as a young 22-year-old man. He told the ministers that when he came home from fighting in Vietnam, he had fought to stop the fighting, to stop the war. And more than that, he committed himself to do whatever it would take to make sure that there would not be war again, ever. And for him, that was what had happened over these last few years from Muscat to Vienna. That is why he fought for the deal. The room was still and silent. Many had tears in their eyes. And then everyone applauded. That too included Javad Zarif and the Iranians. Everyone understood. Everyone had fought for the same thing, for peace, not for war. Thank you.
What an outstanding presentation. Thank you very much, Wendy. The floor is now open to a few questions. We just have about 7 minutes. So please raise your hand and ask a question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for what you have done for peace. And thank you very much for that exceptionally thoughtful presentation. I almost cried. It was nicely done. The question I have is that you talked about the personal feeling between Zarif and Secretary Kerry, or perhaps between you and Abbas. Would you please give us one example where that personal relationship helped resolve one of the many issues or disputes between the U.S. delegation and the Iranian delegation?
Well, I don't want to go in any specific detail because I do try to protect this negotiation, and many people have asked if I'm going to write a book about it, and I think it's premature to do that because I couldn't say everything that needs to be said, and if I did, it could create problems, and I have no desire to do that. So I may write about something about it, but not the tick-tock of every detail of the negotiation. There were many times when we were in a difficult place and Secretary Kerry would either go to the minister's room or the minister would come to his room and they would have it out with each other. There is an example that was in the press where we were at a particularly difficult time and the secretary had sort of had it. And it's not easy to get John Kerry to that point. He is an incredibly patient, generous human being. And so there were people in the dining room in Vienna and all of a sudden they heard screaming through the wall because they did yell at each other when necessary. And those of you who know Mr. Zarif know that he can yell quite well and is quite emotional. And I think that personal relationship was absolutely, absolutely essential. And even though the mistrust never went away, because Abbas and I, Majid Ravanchi and I, had discussions about personal things, it certainly helped in the negotiations. We, at least had more patience for each other, if nothing else. And that was quite crucial. We still email with each other. And I must say that is an enormous change in diplomatic communications. We saw the plus that came out of the Secretary's relationship in getting the sailors home so quickly when they were taken by the Iranians. When we did these negotiations, every time I met with the Iranians, I had a separate meeting on the American citizens who were being held in Iran. It was bilateral. It was just with Abbas and Majid, myself, and either Brooke Anderson and then ultimately Rob Malley, which led to us setting up a separate track, which ultimately brought about the return of most Americans. We still hope dearly that Robert Levinson gets home sooner rather than later. And I think all of those hours were helpful. At the very end of the Americans coming home, I was in Israel at the time that implementation day happened and the Americans came home. It just turned out that way. I was at the Institute for National Security Studies conference to give a big speech, and there was a last-minute holdup because I was emailing back with some friends at the White House because they knew I cared deeply this was happening. There was a last-minute holdup when they weren't going to let Yevgeny and Jason Rezaian's mother leave. And John Kerry got on the phone with Javad, and it got settled and fixed very quickly. Those things could never happen. So to the other question that I think is out here, do I have hopes the relationship is going to change? I agree with what has been said here. We don't know. It is not in our hands. I'm hopeful because we must be hopeful and should be hopeful, but it is not our choice or our decision, and there are many things at play here, and Iran's actions in the region are quite concerning, and we have to deal with them if we're ever going to see change. You have to call one more.
First, thank you for your service to our country. And then secondly, there are reports that of the $100 billion that was unfrozen is being directed towards terrorism. If that is accurate or true, do you believe this is an acceptable consequence of the deal?
The mythology around this $100 billion is really quite extraordinary. This is not, first of all, just make sure everybody understands, this is not American money or taxpayer money. These is Iranian assets that were frozen in foreign bank accounts. They're not in American bank accounts. They're in Emirates, they're in Japan, they're in Korea. They are frozen Iranian assets in foreign banks, number one. Number two, of the approximately $100 billion, the Treasury Department and our intelligence analysts believe there maybe is as much as $50 billion that could be liquid to be returned to Iran, because the others are either in non-performing loans or money owed to China, which China is going to take. And then lastly, it is not in Iran's interest to bring that money, lastly, I have one more point. It is not in Iran's interest to bring that money home because it needs currency abroad to do trade. If it doesn't have currency abroad, it's not going to be able to make commercial deals. Now, the last point's very important. There is no question that money is fungible. And there is no question that lifting economic sanctions means Iran's economy can, if deals go through, do better. And so therefore, I have no doubt that as their economy does better, the IRGC will get more money. But I would remind people that the IRGC and the Quds Force and the MOIS have been able to do what they have done, which is quite a lot, with very little. Largely, I think for in the IRGC's case, not because of the actual budget, but because of the black market, which they controlled when sanctions were in place. The IRGC was not for the deal, and they were not for the deal because they now have to give up their black market income because things are going to be regularized. So I will never say that Iran will get no more money for its nefarious activities as their economy grows. They will. But one, the bet A, there had to be sanctions relief in order for them to do very difficult things from their perspective, pour concrete into the calandria of the Iraq reactor, reduce the number of centrifuges down to 5,000 from 19,000, only keep 300 kilograms stockpile of enriched uranium at 3.67%, not enough to make a bomb. So there had to be a quid pro quo to that deal. Otherwise, there is no negotiation. My own judgment, and more importantly, the President of the United States' judgment, Secretary Kerry's judgment, was that we closed down all the pathways to fissile material, including the covert one, and this was a deal worth having. Oh, good.
Great. Wendy made sure I have to choose a lady in the audience for the next question, so.
Yes. The reason I do this, because I have to stop for a second, is every place I go, unless I'm speaking to an all-female audience, the first 4 questions are from men. And then I stop and I say, I know there are questions out there. And the second reason I do this is the 2 people who spent more time with the Iranians than anyone else were 2 women. Helga Schmidt, who is an extraordinary German diplomat who is been seconded to the European Union and was first Cathy Ashton and Federica Mogherini's deputy. She coordinated everything. She did a lot of the negotiation, just an extraordinary, and myself. So please ask your question.
A lot of pressure. Thank you so much for your dedicated service.
You can handle it, I'm sure.
Thank you so much for your dedicated service to our country.
Thank you.
If you are able to say anything public about this, is there one issue that you felt the United States didn't press hard enough that you regret not doing?
No. Because it's not an either-or process. It's why thinking about the Rubiks Cube, and my team was so great. They made up Rubiks Cubes with all the elements on it so that we'd all have them. And just another funny thing, because the Iranians did cartoons of me as a fox, we became Team Silver Fox. You figure out where the silver came from. And they made T-shirts. I mean, we did all those kind of things to keep our spirits up. So you really have to think about this as a Rubik's Cube. You move any element this way, and another one moves that way. So you can't say, gosh, I wish we'd done more here, because if you'd done more there, you would have had to do less here, or the deal wouldn't have locked into place. That's why I get asked that question every single time, but it's not how a negotiation works. All of the elements are puts and takes on all sides. And remember, all of our negotiating partners had their own priorities, which weren't always the same as ours. And they all had their own teams of experts. And no two countries, even the United States and Great Britain, do calculations the same way, in part because we base our calculations on our own intelligence, which we can't share. So we all come out with different math. And so doing the technical details here, at the end of the day, Secretary Moniz led the technical discussions, and I give our partners tremendous respect for allowing the United States both to lead through Secretary Moniz and to lead through Secretary Kerry. They understood that at the end of the day, if this didn't work, it was the U.S. military who was going to have to carry the weight here. And it was our economic sanctions, our secondary economic sanctions, which were the most forceful sanctions, and the EU did likewise. So everybody understood the United States had bigger stakes here and allowed us to do a lot more than some would have wished.
I have one last question. I'm trying to look for a lady.
No.
No, I can't. They're all men.
Yeah. It's okay. I like men. I've been married to one for 36 years.
You get it.
Yes. In describing the deal, it seems that...
But I think they bring you a mic.
Oh, in describing the deal, you and others some others use the word forever. Iran will never or forever be without. And yet the press reports seem to concentrate on limitations that expire. Can you explain how forever is achieved?
Yes. So the language in the deal is that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. And we understand that print is cheap, right? We get that. However, for 15 years, Iran can only have a stockpile of 300 kilograms of enriched uranium at 3.67%. You cannot make a bomb out of that. For 20 years, the International Atomic Energy Agency, on top of all of the means that they currently have, which is 24/7 access to all of the facilities, electronic seals, video cameras, there's a whole long list. In addition to those 15 years, for 20 years, the International Atomic Energy will have eyes on the production of rotors and bellows, which are the, in essence, active ingredients of a centrifuge. So we will know what they're doing with their centrifuge production, and they have limits on both the numbers and the type of centrifuges they can have. For 25 years, the International Atomic Energy Agency will have what's called uranium accountancy. From the time the uranium comes out of the ground, till it's mined, till it's milled, till it's turned into gas and into a centrifuge, they will count for every inch. The reason this is so important is because for Iran to have a covert program, they would have to create an entire supply chain to do so. And all of these verification and monitoring mechanisms mean that will be impossible for them to do so. And then finally, after 25 years, the Iranians are still required to do the additional protocol. The additional protocol allows the International Atomic Energy Agency access into any facility where they believe there is suspect activity going on. Now, if Iran decided it was going to withdraw from the additional protocol, If they withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we would know it instantaneously, and all of the options we have today, we would have on that day. We would be ready to take military action. This President of the United States commissioned, got paid for, and deployed a weapon that can penetrate underground facilities. That's now been made public, and Iran knows it, and that technology will continue to be updated. We would be able to snap back our sanctions and snap back the multilateral sanctions unilaterally because of the way we constructed the snapback provisions of the agreement. So when I say Iran will not ever have a nuclear weapon, it's because we have all of these layers, from the agreement to the monitoring and verification to the options we still have at our disposal should they cheat in some ways that we didn't anticipate. That is why I don't believe there's a president of the United States who will ever want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Now, there is one candidate who has sort of said some things lately that might make me believe otherwise, but I would hope sanity would prevail in the end.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me again in thanking Wendy for an outstanding presentation.